The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Author's Preface. In starting out on the life of my hero, Alexei Fyodorovich Karamazov, I feel somewhat at a loss. By this I mean that, although I refer to Alexei, Alyosha, as my hero, I am well aware that he is by no means a great man, and this leads me to anticipate such obvious questions as, what is so remarkable about your Alexei Karamazov that you should choose him as your hero? What exactly did he accomplish? Who has heard of him, and what is he famous for? And why should I, the reader, spend time learning the facts of his life? The last question is the fateful one, because all I can answer is, you may find out for yourself from the novel. But what if they read the novel, and are still unconvinced that my Alexei is a remarkable man? I say this because I sadly anticipate it. To me, he is remarkable. But I very much doubt that I will succeed in proving it to the reader. The trouble is that, although I suppose he may be described as a man of good works, he is still indeterminate, not fully recognized as such. But then, would it not be rather strange to expect to find clear-cut characters in times like ours? One thing, though, is beyond doubt. He is a strange person, we might even say an eccentric. And peculiarity and eccentricity are more likely to create prejudice against a man than make people listen to him, especially nowadays when everyone tries to lump all the special cases together and to read some general meaning into the general meaninglessness. Isn't that so? Now, if you don't agree with this, if you believe that it is not true, or at least not necessarily true, it will give me hope that my hero may be of some interest to you. For an eccentric is not necessarily an expectation or an isolated phenomenon. Indeed, it often happens that it is he who embodies the very essence of his time, while his contemporaries somehow seem to have been cut loose from it by gusts of an alien wind. Had it not been for one more difficulty, I would not have ventured into these boring and unclear explanations. I would have started the novel directly without any introduction, reasoning that a reader will finish the book anyway, if he is enjoying it. And the additional difficulty is that, although I have only one life story to tell, there are really two novels here. The main novel is the second one, which describes the life of my hero in our time at this very moment. As to the first novel, it takes place 13 years ago, and is perhaps not even really a novel, but just the description of an important phase of the early youth of my hero. However, I cannot dispense with this first novel because much of the second novel would be incomprehensible without it, and this complicates my original difficulty even further. If I, the biographer, feel that even one novel may be too much for a modest and obscure hero like mine, how can I come forward with the two novels about him? How can I justify such presumptuousness? Being unable to puzzle out these questions, I have decided to leave them unanswered. No doubt, a perspicacious reader will have guessed from the outset that this was what I was driving at, and will be all the more irritated with me for spouting useless phrases and wasting his precious time. Well, I'll answer that precisely. I have been spouting useless phrases and wasting precious time for of all, out of politeness, and, secondly, out of slyness, to be able to say later, well, I more or less warned you, didn't I? Besides, I am really quite glad that my novel split into two stories, while the essential unity of the whole was preserved. Once he has acquainted himself with the first story, the reader will be able to decide for himself whether it is worth his while to start the second. Of course, no one is bound in any way, and the book can be put aside after a couple of pages of the first story, too, and never picked up again. However, there are always some scrupulous readers who are determined to read to the end, no matter what, so that they can pass a fair and impartial judgment. Such, for instance, are all the Russian literary critics, and so I will feel less guilty toward these people if, scrupulous and thorough as they are, I give them a legitimate excuse for putting my story down in the middle of the very first episode. So this is all my introduction. I fully agree that it is quite unnecessary, but since it is already written, I shall let it stand. And now, let's get down to business. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Book 1. A Peculiar Family History. Chapter 1. Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov. Alexei Fyodorovich Karamazov was the third son of Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, a landowner in our district who became a celebrity and is remembered to this day because of the tragic and mysterious end he met exactly 13 years ago, which will be described in its proper place. For the moment, I will only say of this landlord, as they referred to him here, although he spent hardly any time on his land, that he belonged to a peculiar though widespread human type, the sort of man who is not only wretched and depraved, but also muddle-headed in a way that allows him to pull off all sorts of shady little financial deals and not much else. Fyodor Karamazov, for instance, started with next to nothing. He was just about the lowliest landowner among us, a man who would dash off to dine at other people's tables whenever he was given the chance, and who sponged off people as much as he could. Yet, at his death, they found that he had 100,000 rubles in hard cash. And with all that, throughout his life, he remained one of the most muddle-headed eccentrics in our entire district. Let me repeat, it was not stupidity, for most eccentrics are really quite intelligent and cunning, and their lack of common sense is of a special kind, a national variety. He had been married twice and had 3 sons, the eldest, Dmitri, by his first wife, and the other 2, Ivan and Alexei, by the second. Fyodor Karamazov's first wife came from a fairly wealthy family of landed gentry, the Musovs, also from our district. Why should a girl with a dowry, a beautiful girl moreover, one of those bright, clever young things who in this generation are no longer rare, and who even cropped up occasionally in the last, why should she marry such a worthless freak, as they called him? I will not really attempt to explain, but then I once knew a young lady of the old, romantic generation, who, after several years of secret love for a gentleman whom, please note, she could have peacefully married at any moment she chose, invented insurmountable obstacles for herself, and one stormy night jumped from a steep, rather cliff-like bank into a fairly deep, rapid river and drowned, all because she fancied herself an Ophelia out of Shakespeare. Indeed, if the bank on which she had her eye for a long time had been less picturesque, or had there simply been a flat bank, it is conceivable that the suicide would never have taken place at all. This is a true story, and it must be assumed that in the past 2 or 3 generations quite a few familiar incidents have occurred. In the same way, what Adelaida Musov did was undoubtedly an echo of outside influences, and also the act of exasperation of a captive mind. Perhaps she was trying to display feminine independence, to rebel against social conventions, against the despotism of her family and relatives, while her ready imagination convinced her, if only for a moment, that Fyodor Karamazov, despite his reputation as a sponger, was nevertheless one of the boldest and most caustic men of that period of transition toward better things, whereas in reality he was nothing but a nasty buffoon. The fact that the marriage plans included elopement added piquancy to it, making it more exciting for Adelaida. Fyodor, at that time, would of course have done nothing to improve his lowly position, and the opportunity to latch on to a good family and to pocket a dowry was extremely tempting to him. As for love, there does not seem to have been any, either on the bride's part, or, despite her beauty, on Karamazov's. This was perhaps a unique case in Fyodor Karamazov's life, for he was as sensual as a man can be, one who throughout his life was always prepared, at the slightest encouragement, to chase any skirt. But his wife just happened to be one woman who did not appeal to him sensually in the least. Right after the elopement, Adelaida realized that she felt nothing but scorn for her husband. It quickly became obvious what married life was to be. Despite the fact that her family accepted the situation quite soon and gave the runaway bride her dowry, relations between husband and wife became an everlasting succession of quarrels. It was rumored that, in these quarrels, the young wife displayed incomparably more dignity and generosity than her husband, who, it was found out later, soon wheedled out of her every kopeck of the 25,000 rubles she had received. So that, so far as she was concerned, those thousands were sunk in deep waters never to be salvaged again. As to the little country estate and the quite decent townhouse, there was also part of her dowry. He kept trying desperately to have them transferred to his name by some suitable deed. He probably would have succeeded because of the loathing and disgust his constant pleading and begging inspired in his wife, because she would do anything to have peace, sick and tired as she was of him. But luckily Adelaida's family intervened in time to put a stop to his greed. People knew that husband and wife often came to actual blows, and rumor had it that it was she who beat him, rather than he her. Indeed, Adelaida was hot-tempered, bold, dark, and impatient lady endowed with remarkable physical strength. Finally, she eloped with a half-starved tutor, a former divinity student, leaving her husband with their 3-year-old boy, Mitya. Fyodor Karamazov immediately installed a regular harem in the house and indulged in the most scandalous drunken debauchery. But between one orgy and the next, he would drive all over the province, complaining tearfully to all that sundry of Adelaida's desertion, and revealing on these occasions certain unsavory intimate details of their conjugal life that any other husband would have been ashamed to mention. He even seemed to enjoy, indeed to feel flattered by, his ridiculous role as a cuckolded husband, for he insisted on describing his own disgrace in every minute detail, even embellishing on it. "Why, Fyodor Pavlovitch," people remarked, "you act as if an honor had been bestowed upon you. You seemed pleased despite your sorrow." Many even added that he was delighted to have the role of clown thrust upon him, that he only pretended to be unaware of his ridiculous position in order to make it even funnier. But who can really tell? Possibly he was quite ingenuous about it all. He finally succeeded in getting on the track of his runaway wife. It led to Petersburg, where the poor thing had moved with her divinity student, and where she had abandoned herself to a life of complete emancipation. Fyodor Karamazov immediately busied himself with preparations for the journey to Petersburg, and perhaps he would have gone, although he certainly had no idea what he would do there. But once he had decided to go, he felt that he had a special reason for plunging into a bout of unrestrained drunkenness, to fortify himself for the journey, and just at that time his in-laws received word that Adelaida had died in Petersburg. She died suddenly, in a garret, of typhus according to some, of starvation according to others. Karamazov was drunk when he learned of his wife's death, and some say he exclaimed joyously, raising his hand to heaven, "Lord, now let your servant depart in peace." But according to others, he wept sobbing like a little boy, so that people felt sorry for him despite the disgust he aroused in them. It is quite possible that they were all right, that he rejoiced in his regained freedom and wept for the woman from whom he had been freed, both at once. In most cases, people, even the most vicious, are much more naive and simple-minded than we assume them to be, and this is true of ourselves too. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Book 1. A Peculiar Family History. Chapter 2. He Gets Rid of His Eldest Son. It is, of course, easy to imagine what sort of father such a man would be, how he would bring up his children, and he lived up to expectation. He completely and thoroughly neglected his child by Adelaida. He did not do so out of any deliberate malice or resentment toward the child's mother, but simply because he forgot all about the little boy, and while he was pestering people with his tears and self-pitying stories, while he was turning his home into a house of debauchery, a faithful servant of the household, Gregory, took the 3-year-old Mitya into his care. If it hadn't been for Gregory, there would have been no change to the boy's shirt. Moreover, it so happened that the child's relations on his mother's side had also, at first, forgotten his existence. Mitya's grandfather, that is, Adelaida's father, Mr. Musov, was no longer alive. His widow, Mitya's grandmother, had moved to Moscow, and was in very poor health. And in the meantime, Adelaida's sisters had married and moved away, so Mitya spent almost a year in Gregory's little house in the servants' quarters, and even if his father had occasionally remembered him, he could not, after all, have been completely unaware of the child's existence. Karamazov would have sent his son back to the servants' quarters anyway, because a child would have been in the way during the orgies. But one day a first cousin of Adelaida's returned from Paris, Peter Musov, who was later to settle abroad permanently, was at that time still a young man, but he was already an exception among the Musovs. He was an enlightened, big-city gentleman, glittering with foreign polish, a European through and through, who, in later life, was to become a typical liberal of the 1840s and 1850s. In the course of his life, he came in contact with some of the most liberal minds of his era, both in Russia and abroad. He met Proudhon personally, as well as Buchanan, and, toward the end of his wanderings, liked the best to tell of his experiences during the 3 days of the February Revolution of 1848, which he had witnessed in Paris, implying that he himself had taken part in it, just short, perhaps, of manning the barricades. This was one of the most gratifying recollections of his youth. He was a man of independent means, with an income from an estate of 1,000-odd souls, as property was evaluated in the old days. That splendid estate was located just outside our town and bordered on the lands of our famous monastery. No sooner had young Peter Musov taken possession of his estate than he started an endless lawsuit against the monastery. It was something about fishing privileges or woodcutting rights. I'm not sure which, but he felt that in suing clericals, he was doing his duty as a citizen and an enlightened man. When Musov heard what had happened to Adelaida, whom he, of course, remembered having even, at one time, taken a special interest in her, and when he learned of Mitya's plight, he decided to intervene, although that involved approaching Karamazov, whom Musov loathed and despised with all the ardor of youth. This was the first time that he had met Fyodor Karamazov. He told him point-blank that he wished to take the boy and be responsible for his education. Later he'd like to tell at length what had happened at that meeting, because he felt it revealed a great deal about Karamazov's character. When Musov first broached the subject of Mitya, the fellow stared at him blankly, as though he could not understand what child Musov was talking about, and he seemed positively taken aback when reminded that he had a young son. And although Musov's story may have been exaggerated, there was certainly an element of truth in it. It is a fact that all his life Karamazov liked to act the fool and assume all sorts of surprising roles. He would do so even when he had nothing to gain. Indeed, even when it could be positively to his disadvantage, as in this instance. This is a quirk found in many people, even very clever ones, let alone the likes of Fyodor Karamazov. Musov at first went about the matter with some zest, and was even appointed Mitya's guardian, jointly with Karamazov, since the boy had, after all, the small estate in the townhouse coming to him as his inheritance from his mother, and he moved the boy to his house, but not being tied down by a family of his own, just as soon as he had wound up his business in our town, which consisted of collecting the revenue from his estate, he went dashing off to Paris for a long stay. He left the boy in the care of a relative of his, a lady who lived in Moscow. Musov settled in Paris for good and lost sight of Mitya, his interest in the boy petering out completely after the February Revolution, which made such an ineradicable impression on him. In the meantime, the Moscow lady died, and Mitya passed into the care of one of her married daughters. I believe he had to change homes for a 4th time soon afterward. I won't expand on this topic here, since I will have a great deal to say after about this firstborn son of Fyodor Karamazov's, but I must supply a few facts right away, without which I could not even begin my novel. First of all, Mitya, that is, Dmitri Fyodorovich Karamazov, was the only one of Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov's son who grew up under the impression that, however hard up he might be, he would, when he came of age, come into his inheritance from his mother, and that he would then be financially independent. He was unruly as a boy, and as a young man. He dropped out of the classical secondary school, but later was admitted to military school. From there he was sent on active duty with an army unit in the Caucasus, where he was given an officer's commission in the field. He was soon demoted to the ranks for fighting a duel, only to be restored to his rank again for gallantry. After this he led a wild, gay life that cost a good deal of money, since, until he came of age, he never received a single kopeck from his father. He was deep in debt by the time that day arrived. He only met and got to know the old man when he came to our town to demand an accounting of the estate left him by his mother. It would appear that, even then, Dmitri took a dislike to his father. He stayed at the paternal house only a short time, leaving as soon as he had managed to get a very small sum from the old man, together with some vague agreement about sending him the revenue from his estate. It must be noted here that on this occasion Dmitri failed to find out from his father what the total worth of his estate was, or what income it yielded. Karamazov discovered right away, and this must be noted too, that his son had an erroneous and exaggerated notion of his inheritance, and this discovery pleased him, for it fitted in with his own schemes. He realized that the young man was irresponsible, violent, passionate, unruly, impatient, and that he couldn't wait to satisfy all his whims and impulses. And Karamazov now knew how to handle Dmitri. The fellow could always be placated, at least temporarily, with small handouts. Karamazov proceeded immediately to exploit his son's weakness, putting him off with small sums. This went on for 4 years until finally Dmitri lost patience. He made a second appearance in town, this time to force on his father a final settlement of their accounts. He was quite stunned to hear from Karamazov that he had already received, in the many installments, a sum amounting to the value of his estate, that is, that, if anything, it was he who was now in debt to his father, and that, moreover, in view of such and such an agreement, which he himself had insisted upon at one point, he had renounced all further claims, etc., etc. The young man was dumbfounded, accused his father of cheating him, and acted as if he would go out of his mind. It was this confrontation between Karamazov and his eldest son that led to the catastrophe which is the subject, or at least the external plot, of my first preliminary novel. But before I start on that narrative, I will have to say a few words about Karamazov's other sons and explain their origins. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Part 1. A Peculiar Family History. Chapter 3. The Second Marriage and the Second Family. Shortly after getting the 4-year-old Mitya off his hands, Fyodor Karamazov married a second time. His second marriage lasted 8 years. He brought back his second wife, Sophia, who was a very young girl from another province, where he had gone to transact some small business affair with a Jew who was his partner in the deal. Drunkard and lecher though he was, Karamazov was constantly on the lookout for a profitable opportunity to invest some of his capital, and, since he was encumbered by scruples, these ventures were usually quite successful. Sophia was the daughter of an obscure deacon. She lost her parents in early childhood, and, having no other relatives, was brought up by a wealthy old lady, the widow of General Vorokov. The old woman was her benefactress and her tormentor. I don't know the details, but I heard that one day the meek and uncomplaining creature had to be cut down from a rope she had tied to a nail in the storeroom. This shows how hard it was for her to submit to the whims and the constant nagging of the old woman who, although not really wicked, had been made tyrannical and eccentric by sheer idleness. When Fyodor Karamazov asked for Sophia's hand, Mrs. Vorokov made inquiries about him, and, consequently, when he reappeared, had him thrown out. So as with his first marriage, he asked the girl to elope with him. Had Sophia known a bit more about his past, she might have turned him down, even in her situation. But everything had taken place in another province, and besides, what judgment could a 16-year-old girl make, when all she felt was that she would rather jump in the river than stay with her benefactress? This is how the poor thing came to exchange a benefactress for a benefactor. This time, Fyodor Karamazov didn't get any dowry. The general's widow was outraged and refused to give her charge a single kopeck, laying a curse upon them both instead. But then, on this occasion, collecting a dowry had not been Karamazov's main motive. Although up until then he had been aroused exclusively by the coarser types of feminine good looks, the lecher's imagination was caught now by the striking beauty of this innocent creature, and, indeed, by her childlike innocence itself. As he used to say himself later, with a nasty snicker, those innocent eyes of hers slit my soul open like a razor. In a lecher like Fyodor Karamazov, of course, it only added a new spice to his sensual desires. He felt that, since he had accepted this wife without dowry, he had every right to treat her without any consideration whatever. She was, he said, indebted to him, since he had practically cut her down from a rope. He took advantage of her phenomenal humility to trample underfoot the most ordinary decencies of marriage, even to the point of bringing loose women into the house and holding orgies in her presence. To indicate how far he went, I will mention that Gregory, the dour, stupid, argumentative old servant, who had hated his former mistress, Adelaida, now took Sophia's side, stood up for her, and swore back at his master in a manner that was quite intolerable from a servant. Once he even broke up a party and drove the guests and the woman out of the house. After a while, the wretched girl, who had been terrorized since early childhood, broke down, afflicted with a nervous disorder sometimes found in the peasant women, who are called shriekers. Her sickness brought on attacks of hysteria so violent that at times she completely lost her reason. But this did not prevent her from bearing Fyodor Karamazov 2 sons, Ivan, in the first year of marriage, and Alexei, 3 years later. When she died, Alexei was only just over 3, but I know for sure that he remembered his mother all his life, though, of course, as in a dream. After their mother's death, the fate of the 2 little boys was a repetition of their older brother Mitya's. Their father seemed to forget them immediately, and they were so completely neglected that, like Mitya before them, they ended up in Gregory's cottage, and it was in the servants' quarters that the boys were found by the rich and eccentric widow of General Vorokov, their mother's former benefactress. For the entire 8 years of the marriage, she had seethed under the insult she had received, but she had kept herself constantly informed about Sophia and knew all about her sad plight, her sickness, and the outrageous situation in which she was caught. When she heard these things, she would comment to her lady companions, "It serves her right. God is making her pay for her ingratitude." Exactly 3 months after Sophia's death, the general's widow suddenly appeared in our town, going straight to Mr. Karamazov's house. Altogether, she spent only half an hour in town, but the amount she accomplished in that short time was amazing. When she arrived late in the afternoon, Fyodor Karamazov, whom she had not seen for 8 years, came out to meet her in a rather besotted state. Without a word of explanation, she stepped up to him and slapped him, landing 2 mighty resounding smacks on his face. Then she caught him by the forelock, pulling it hard 3 times. Then, still without explanation, she went to Gregory's cottage, where she found the 2 little boys. Noticing right away that they were unwashed and that their shirts were dirty, she turned on Gregory and slapped his face too. She announced that she was taking the boys away with her, and, leading them out just as they were, in their dirty shirts, sat them in her carriage, wrapped them in carriage rugs, and drove away to her own town. Gregory took the slaps slavishly, without a word of recrimination, and as he saw the lady off to her carriage, he bowed deeply from the waist, solemnly pronouncing that the Lord would reward her for taking the orphans. "But you're a blockhead all the same," the old lady shouted at him as the carriage drove off. Later, after he had thought it over, Karamazov decided that it was all in his best interest, and he made no difficulties when the general's widow asked his formal consent to her taking charge of the boys' education. As to the slaps he had received, he dashed all around the town, telling everyone about the incident himself. When the general's widow died not long after, she had bequeathed 1,000 rubles to each boy, to be spent exclusively on his education, but sparingly, so that it would last until their coming of age. She added that this sum was more than adequate for children of such a background, but that if anyone felt it was not, let him untie his own purse strings, and so on and so forth. I don't read her will myself, but I understand that it was something along these lines, eccentric and very strangely worded. However, the old woman's principal heir, the marshal of nobility of the province, Efim Petrovitch Polanov, turned out to be an extremely honorable man. He informed Fyodor Karamazov of the will, but realized immediately that such a man would never contribute a kopeck to the education of his own children. Although Karamazov never refused directly, he always found reasons for delaying his contribution, occasionally even spouting sentimentalities. So Polanov decided to take care of the abandoned boys himself, and he grew quite fond of them, particularly of the younger, Alexei, who lived for a long time in his house as one of the family. It must be noted right here that if the young Karamazovs were indebted to anyone for their upbringing and education, it was above all to this Mr. Polanov, one of the most generous and honorable men to be found. He kept intact the original 1,000 left to each boy by the general's widow, so that, when they came of age, each of them would receive 2,000 rubles. thanks to the accumulated interest. Polanov paid for their upkeep and education, cut of his own pocket, spending, incidentally, considerably more than 1,000 rubles on each boy. Again, I won't give a lengthy account of their childhood and school years, but will only outline the most important facts. Of the elder, Ivan, I will only say that he grew into a sullen and secretive boy, although by no means a timorous one. I gather that by the time he was 10 or so, he had become aware that he and his brother were not being brought up in their own home, but were, in fact, living on other people's charity, and that there was something about their father that made the very mention of his name a cause for embarrassment. Very early in life, almost in infancy, at least some people claimed, the boy started to display an uncanny aptitude for learning. I don't know exactly how it came to pass, but when he was barely 13, he left Polanov's family, being sent to a secondary school in Moscow, where he boarded at the house of a celebrated and experienced educator, a boyhood friend of Polanov's. Later, Ivan Karamazov liked to say that he had been sent to Moscow thanks to Mr. Polanov's zeal for good works, because Polanov had been carried away by the idea that a boy endowed with a genius for learning should be taught by a teacher of genius. However, neither Polanov nor the brilliant educator was alive by the time Ivan entered the university, and since Polanov had somehow neglected to make the proper arrangements to cut through the usual Russian red tape and make the bequests, now worth more than 2,000 rubles each, quickly available to the boys, Ivan could not get the money and had to earn his own living during the first 2 years at university. It must be pointed out that on this occasion, he made no attempt whatsoever to ask his father for assistance. It is uncertain whether he acted out of pride, out of contempt for his father, or simply because he reasoned in a cold and detached way that he would never get any substantial help from him anyway. In any case, the young man did not despair and quickly found work, first tutoring at a few kopecks an hour, then making the rounds of the editorial offices of newspapers, peddling 10-line news items on street incidents, or the like that he signed Eyewitness. I gather that these items were so originally and strikingly presented that the newspapers were glad to run them. This, in itself, goes to show the young man's superiority in practical and intellectual matters over the crowd of needy students of both sexes, who night and day swarmed through the offices of Moscow and Petersburg newspapers and magazines, unable to think up anything more original than to beg for translations from the French or for odd copying jobs. Once, Ivan Karamazov got to know people on the editorial staffs. He kept in touch with them, so that during his last years at the university he was able to publish reviews of books on a variety of specialized subjects, in which he showed considerable talent. Thus he gradually gained a good reputation in literary circles. However, it was not until quite recently that he succeeded in attracting the attention of a wider circle of readers, and it was one particular incident that made them notice and remember him, and a rather curious incident at that. Ivan Karamazov had been graduated from the university, had collected his 2,000 rubles, and was planning to take a trip abroad, when one of the major newspapers carried a very strange article of his that caught the interest of even non-specialists. The most remarkable thing about it was that the topic seemed to be quite outside Ivan's field, since he had specialized in the natural sciences. The article was devoted to the problem much discussed at the time, the ecclesiastical courts. After examining various opinions that had already been expressed on the subject, Ivan presented his own views. The impact was due mostly to the tone and to the unexpectedness of the conclusions. First, many clerics greeted the author as one of their camp. Then, not only secularists, but even outright atheists joined in the applause. Finally, however, some perspicacious persons decided that the whole article was a hoax, an insolent joke he had played on them all. I have mentioned this incident because the article and the argument it stirred up even reached our famous monastery, where the matter of the ecclesiastical courts elicited great interest. They were perplexed by it, and when they noticed the signature under it, their interest increased even further, since the author happened to be a native of our part of the country and a son of that Fyodor Karamazov. Then, in the midst of it all, the author himself suddenly appeared in our town. Why did Ivan choose to come to our town just then? I remember the uneasiness that question stirred in me at the time. This fateful visit of his, which was to trigger off a whole chain of events, remained unclear to me almost to the end. In general, it was strange that such a cultured, proud, and apparently prudent young man as Ivan should come to that scandalous house to join a father who had ignored him all his life, who didn't know him, indeed, hardly remembered that he existed, a father who would most certainly have refused to give him money under any circumstances, and who lived in constant dread lest either of his younger sons, Ivan or Alexei, should one day come and ask him for help. Yet the young man came and installed himself in his father's house. He spent 1 month there, then another, and the two of them seemed to live in perfect agreement. I was not the only one who was surprised. Many others wondered about it too. Peter Musov, the cousin of Karamazov's first wife, whom I mentioned earlier, happened to have returned just then from Paris, where he had settled for good, and was staying on his estate just outside our town. I remember that he was the most puzzled of all. Once he had made the acquaintance of the young man, who interested him a great deal, and with whom he used to exchange sophisticated barbs, although his feelings were often secretly hurt when he was bested in these confrontations. "He is proud," he said of Ivan then. "A man like that will always find money to live on. Why, even now he has enough to go abroad. So what can be his motive for coming here? He certainly didn't come in the hope of getting money out of his father, for it is obvious that nothing in the world would make his father give him any. Nor does he go in for wine and debauchery, and yet old Karamazov seems unable to take a step without him. In fact, I have never seen two men get along so famously, and they did. Moreover, the young man exercised an obvious influence on his father, who sometimes almost seemed as if he would heed his advice. Although he was often his nasty, unbridled self still, his behavior began to improve slightly. It was only later that he learned that Ivan had come, at least partly, at the request of his older brother, Dmitri, whom he also met and got to know for the first time during this visit to our town. The two brothers had been corresponding before on an important matter that concerned Dmitri more than Ivan. What it was, the reader will learn at great length in good time. However, even when I learned about that matter, Ivan Karamazov remained a mystery to me, and I still did not understand why he had come. Let me add that Ivan seemed to act as a mediator between his father and his brother Dmitri, who by then had completely broken off relations, Dmitri even instituting legal proceedings against the old man. I must emphasize here that this was the very first meeting of the Karamazovs, the first time that some members of that strange family had set eyes on each other. Now Karamazov's youngest son, Alexei, had been living among us for the past year, and we had met him before his brothers. It is of this brother, Alexei, that I find it the most difficult to speak in this introductory part of my narrative, although it is indispensable to do so before I bring him out onto the stage of my novel. I must write an introductory piece about him too, if only to explain a point that may strike my readers as very strange, namely, that my future hero will have to wear the cassock of a novice at his very first appearance. Yet he had been living at our monastery for a year or so, and, indeed, it looked as if he were preparing to spend the rest of his life within its walls.